There are moments in life when time folds back upon itself, when the ordinary act of climbing attic stairs becomes a journey through decades, when dust-covered boxes hold not merely old belongings but entire worlds we thought lost to history. This is the story of such a moment, and of the man whose greatest act was silence itself. Consider how many secrets we keep, small ones mostly, a purchase we don't mention, a worry we shoulder alone. But imagine keeping a secret so profound that it contains 669 lives within it. Imagine carrying that silence for 50 years, through breakfast conversations and garden work, through grandchildren's birthdays and quiet evenings by the fire. Imagine never once mentioning that you had changed the entire course of history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn light fell softly through the attic window of the Winton home in Maidenhead, England, on that particular day in 1988. Greta Winton, then in her 70s, had climbed the narrow stairs with a practical purpose. The local charity shop needed donations. Surely, after decades of marriage and accumulated possessions, there were things they no longer needed gathering dust up here. She moved between boxes and forgotten furniture. That particular archaeology of long lives lived in one place. Here, a lamp from their first flat together. There, Nicholas's old briefcases from his years in banking, the leather cracked and dry. The air held that distinctive scent of old paper and settled time, a smell like memory itself made tangible. Greta pulled open a wardrobe door, expecting perhaps old coats or unused linens. Instead, her hand found leather. A scrapbook, substantial and heavy, pushed far back into the darkness as though hidden deliberately. She lifted it into the slanting afternoon. Light and dust motes swirled in the sunbeam like tiny galaxies disturbed. The leather was dark brown, worn smooth at the edges where hands had held it. When she opened the cover, the binding creaked softly, the sound of something sealed being finally unsealed. The first page held a photograph. A child's face, perhaps 8 years old, eyes dark and serious, staring directly into the camera with that particular stillness children had before they learned to smile automatically for photographs. Beneath the photograph, in Nicholas's precise handwriting, a name, Hana Rechtova, and beneath that, numbers that meant nothing to Greta yet. Dates, addresses, a transport number. She turned the page. Another child, Vera Diamantova, same careful notation. Same solemn eyes looking out from 1939, from a world Greta knew her husband had visited but about which he rarely spoke. She kept turning pages. The children multiplied. Photograph after photograph, each face unique, each gaze meeting hers across 50 years. Some smiled tentatively, others looked frightened. A few appeared defiant, their small chins lifted as though bracing against whatever came next. Greta's hands began to tremble slightly, not from age, but from dawning comprehension that arrived slowly, like light spreading across a landscape at sunrise. These were not just photographs. This was a record. This was evidence. Between the photographs she found documents, travel permits bearing Nazi stamps, letters written in Czech and German, the handwriting urgent, sometimes barely legible. One envelope, when she carefully extracted its contents, held a mother's plea written in broken English. "Please," the letter began. "My daughter Vera is good girl, very quiet. She will make no trouble. Please to save her. I beg you on my knees. The situation here is very bad. Please." The paper felt impossibly thin in Greta's fingers, as though the weight of desperation had worn it down. She could see the impression where the writer's pen had pressed hard at certain words. Please, save, beg. The date at the top read March 1939. 50 years ago, almost exactly. Half a century since some desperate mother in Prague had sat down to write to strangers, offering her daughter to the unknown rather than keep her in the known danger. Greta sat down on an old trunk, the scrapbook heavy in her lap. She turned more pages, and with each turn, a larger story assembled itself from fragments. Lists written in Nicholas's handwriting, columns of names and numbers that went on for pages, financial records showing £50 sterling deposited for each child, correspondence with the British Home Office, letters from something called the British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia, and photographs. Always more photographs. By the time she reached the middle of the scrapbook, Greta had seen perhaps 300 small faces. She began to notice patterns. Some children wore their best clothes, as though dressed for a special occasion. Others looked as though they'd been photographed hastily, their collars askew, their hair uncombed. Several held teddy bears or dolls gripped tightly in small fists. One photograph stopped her completely. A little boy, perhaps 6 years old, stood alone on what appeared to be a train platform. Behind him, barely visible, an adult's hand rested on his shoulder. A parent, most likely, though they remained outside the frame. The boy's face held an expression Greta couldn't quite name. Not fear exactly. Not sadness. Something older than his years should allow. A knowledge that childhood had ended, perhaps. An understanding that this photograph marked a before and after in his small life. Beneath his image, Nicholas had written, Peter Hurst, Transport 3, March 23rd, 1939. Foster family arranged, Mr. and Mrs. Roberts, Manchester. The specificity of it struck her. The dates, the names, the careful tracking. This was not casual documentation. This was someone's mission, recorded with the same precision Nicholas had always applied to his work at the stock exchange. Every transaction accounted for, every detail preserved. Near the back of the scrapbook, Greta found something that made her breath catch. A list titled Train 9, September 1st, 1939. Beneath it, 250 names, each written out in full with ages beside them. But these entries differed from all the others. Beside each name, instead of a foster family placement or arrival date, Nicholas had written only one word, repeated 250 times down the page, cancelled. And beneath that terrible inventory, in her husband's hand, a single sentence. War declared this morning. All borders sealed. Train never departed. Greta closed the scrapbook carefully, as though sudden movement might somehow change what she'd discovered. She sat in the quiet attic with September afternoon light falling through the small window, and she thought about the man she'd shared 50 years of marriage with. The man who'd eaten breakfast across from her every morning, who'd tended his roses with meticulous care, who'd helped their daughters with homework, who'd grown old beside her in comfortable, ordinary ways. That man had saved 669 children from certain death, and never mentioned it once. She tried to imagine it. Nicholas, at 29 years old, decades before she'd met him, working in Prague while Hitler's armies closed in. Nicholas writing these lists. Nicholas somehow arranging trains through Nazi territory. Nicholas corresponding with desperate parents, with British bureaucrats, with foster families. Nicholas doing all of this, and then, somehow, putting the scrapbook in the attic and living an entire life afterward without speaking of it. The silence seemed suddenly more remarkable than the rescue itself. Anyone might act in crisis, the young often do, but to carry such a thing without mentioning it, without claiming credit or seeking recognition, without using it to explain yourself during arguments or to impress at dinner parties, that required a different kind of courage entirely. Greta stood, still holding the scrapbook, and made her way carefully down the attic stairs. She found Nicholas in the garden, as she'd expected. He was pruning the roses, his movements methodical and practiced. 79 years old, still trim, still precise in his habits. He wore his old gardening sweater, the one with patched elbows. She walked across the lawn toward him, and something in her approach must have alerted him, because he looked up, secateurs in hand, and saw what she carried. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The afternoon held its breath. A blackbird sang somewhere in the hedge. The scrapbook rested between them like a question that had waited half a century to be asked. "I found this," Greta said simply, holding it out slightly. "In the attic." Nicholas looked at the scrapbook, then at her face, then back at the scrapbook. He set down his secateurs with characteristic care, lining them up properly on the garden bench. "Ah," he said quietly. "That." "Nicholas," she said, and her voice held wonder rather than accusation. "What is this? Who are all those children?" He was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. His hands, those same hands that had written all those careful lists, rested on his knees. When he finally spoke, his voice was matter-of-fact, almost apologetic. In 1939, before the war, I helped bring some children out of Czechoslovakia. Jewish children, mostly. Their parents wanted them safe in England. Some children, Greta repeated softly. Nicholas, there are hundreds of photographs in here. 669, he said, with the precision that defined him. 669 children on 8 trains, plus the 9th train that never left. The number hung in the air between them. 669 lives, each one a universe of possibility. 669 children who had grown into adults now in their late 50s and 60s, living somewhere in the world because of this quiet man's actions 50 years before. Why didn't you ever tell me? Greta asked. In all these years? Nicholas shrugged slightly, a gesture so quintessentially him that despite everything, it made her smile. It was a long time ago. During the war, everyone was doing what they could. It didn't seem worth mentioning afterward. Didn't seem worth mentioning. 669 lives didn't seem worth mentioning. It was perhaps the most extraordinary understatement Greta had ever heard. She sat down beside him on the garden bench, the scrapbook between them now, and together they began to turn its pages. As the afternoon lengthened into evening, Nicholas told her the story he'd kept silent for 50 years. He told it simply, without drama, as though describing a particularly complicated business transaction, rather than an act that had altered the trajectory of hundreds of lives. But Greta, listening, understood something her husband perhaps didn't, that this silence had been its own kind of testimony, that sometimes the greatest acts are those we don't speak of, that heroism might look less like dramatic gesture and more like quiet competence applied to impossible situations, that changing the world might be as simple and as difficult as a young man deciding to do what seemed necessary rather than what seemed possible. The scrapbook's pages turned slowly in the fading light. Each photograph a life saved, each name a family continued, each careful notation a moment when one person chose action over paralysis, organization over overwhelm, persistence over despair, and all of it hidden in an attic for 50 years, waiting for exactly this autumn afternoon when time would fold back upon itself and the past would suddenly become present again, demanding finally to be seen and known and understood for what it was. The story of Nicholas Winton was about to begin its second life, emerging from silence into light. But that beginning started here, in this quiet moment, in an ordinary English garden, with an extraordinary scrapbook held between 2 hands that trembled slightly as they turned its pages and read its testimony at last. To understand how an ordinary man becomes extraordinary, we must travel backward through time to a moment of choice. December 1938. A young stockbroker stands in his London flat, holding a telephone receiver, listening to a friend's voice crack with urgency across the crackling line. In such moments, the entire architecture of a life can shift on a single decision. Nicholas Winton, 29 years old, had earned his holiday. The London Stock Exchange demanded precision, long hours, and nerves that could withstand the daily drama of money won and lost. He'd planned his Christmas break meticulously, as he planned everything. 2 weeks, skiing in Switzerland with friends. Fresh mountain air, the clean simplicity of snow and speed and laughter in the alpine lodges at night. His bags were already packed. The train tickets lay on his desk. In a few hours, he would lock his flat and begin the journey south toward mountains and escape. Then the telephone rang. Martin Blake's voice came through, distorted but unmistakable. Martin, who'd worked with Winton in refugee assistance, helping Jewish families escape Germany as Hitler's power expanded like a dark stain across Europe. Martin, who was calling now not from London but from Prague. "Nicholas," Martin said, and even through the poor connection, Winton could hear something in his friend's tone that made him grip the receiver tighter. "Nicholas, you need to see this. You need to come to Prague. Now. I'm leaving for Switzerland in 3 hours," Winton replied, glancing at his packed suitcase. "The skiing trip. I've been planning it for months. Cancel it. Martin's voice held an edge Winton had never heard before. Desperation. Fear. Something beyond both. There are thousands of refugees here. Families fleeing Hitler, pouring into Czechoslovakia. Children freezing in camps. Nicholas, they're dying. Someone needs to do something, and I can't do this alone. Think about that moment. A comfortable life in London versus the unknown chaos of a refugee crisis. Skiing holidays versus human suffering. The easy path versus the necessary one. How many of us, hearing such a call, would find reasons to decline? Previous commitments, work responsibilities. The reasonable argument that one person can't possibly make a difference against such overwhelming need. Nicholas Winton stood in his London flat, looking at his packed bags, his ski equipment, his carefully arranged escape from winter's darkness into mountain light. He thought for perhaps 30 seconds. "I'll take the next train," he said. "Meet me at Wilson Station." He replaced the receiver, unpacked his skiing equipment, and repacked with warmer clothes suitable for a very different kind of winter. Sometimes the trajectory of history pivots on such quiet moments. No dramatic music, no grand speeches, just a man changing his plans because a friend asked him to witness something that demanded witnessing. The journey to Prague took him through a Europe already transforming itself. At border crossings, officials scrutinized papers with new intensity. In train compartments, conversations happened in whispers. The newspapers spoke of Munich agreements and appeasement, of Chamberlain's promises of peace in our time. But everyone travelling eastward that December knew what the papers wouldn't fully admit. War was coming. The only questions were when and how completely it would consume everything. Winton arrived in Prague on a December evening, when darkness fell early and absolute. The city that had once been called the jewel of Central Europe now carried a different atmosphere. Fear had a scent, he discovered. It smelled like coal smoke and unwashed bodies, and something else harder to name. The smell of a civilization beginning to understand its own fragility. Martin Blake met him at Wilson Station, as promised. His friend looked older than Winton remembered, though only months had passed since they'd last met. That's what sustained exposure to suffering does. It ages you from the inside out, wearing away the comfortable assumptions that let most people sleep peacefully at night. They didn't speak much during the taxi ride. Martin simply directed the driver to the outskirts of the city, where the refugee camps had been established in whatever spaces could be found. Abandoned warehouses, empty lots, buildings never meant to house humans, now packed with families who had nowhere else to go. When they arrived, Winton stepped out into cold that seemed to cut through his coat and straight to bone. But the cold wasn't the worst of it. What struck him immediately, what would stay with him for the rest of his long life, were the sounds. Children crying, not the temporary tears of small frustrations, but the deeper sobbing of cold and hunger and confusion. Women calling names, trying to keep track of families fragmenting under pressure. Men arguing in multiple languages, desperate conversations about permits and borders and the mathematics of survival. And underneath it all, a low murmur of human misery that rose into the December night, like smoke from the inadequate fires people had lit in oil drums for warmth. "This is one camp," Martin said quietly beside him. "There are others. Thousands of people, Nicholas. Most of them Jewish families who saw what was happening in Germany and Austria and ran. They thought Czechoslovakia would be safe. But now, with the Munich agreement, Hitler's already annexing the Sudetenland. It's only a matter of time before he takes the Rebleifly. Rest. These people have nowhere to go." Winton walked into the camp, his shoes crunching on frozen ground. A mother sat on a wooden crate, rocking an infant bundled in inadequate blankets. Nearby, a group of children huddled together for warmth, their faces pale in the firelight. One little girl, perhaps 7 years old, stared at him with eyes that seemed too knowing, too aware of adult terrors for a child's face to hold. "How many children?" Winton heard himself ask. "Thousands," Martin replied. "Just in Prague and the surrounding areas. Thousands. Their parents are desperate to get them out, to get them anywhere safe. But there's no system, no organisation. The British government has agreed to take unaccompanied Jewish children from Germany and Austria, the Kindertransport. But nothing's been set up for Czechoslovakia. No one's organising it. So the children just sit here, waiting while their parents try to navigate bureaucracies that move slower than Hitler's armies. Winton watched the little girl with the knowing eyes. She was crouching near a fire now, holding her hands out toward warmth that barely reached her. Her coat was too thin, her shoes had holes. When she coughed, it sounded wet and deep, the kind of cough that in winter camps becomes pneumonia, and pneumonia becomes a child's grave. Something shifted in him in that moment. Later, he would struggle to describe it. Not a dramatic revelation, not a voice from heaven or a sudden certainty of purpose. More like a door opening in his mind, showing him a simple truth he couldn't then unsee. Someone needed to organize this. Someone needed to cut through the bureaucracy and arrange trains and find foster families and move these children from death's waiting room into life's possibilities. Someone needed to do it immediately, because time was running out and children were dying right now, not in some theoretical future. And if someone needed to do it, and no one else was, then that someone might as well be him. "Show me how it works," he said to Martin. "The Kindertransport from Germany. Show me the paperwork, the requirements, the process. If it's working there, we can make it work here." They spent that night and the following days learning the machinery of rescue. Winton discovered that the British government's agreement was both generous and restrictive. Yes, they would accept unaccompanied Jewish children under age 17, but each child needed a place to go, a foster family willing to house them. Each child required a £50 bond deposited with the government to ensure they wouldn't become financial burdens. Each child needed proper documentation, travel permits, visas. The amount of paperwork was staggering. For one child to travel legally from Czechoslovakia through Nazi-controlled territory to Britain required dozens of documents, each stamped and signed by multiple authorities. Multiply that by thousands of children, and the administrative challenge became clear. No wonder no organization had attempted it. The logistics alone seemed designed to defeat good intentions. Winton looked at the requirements and saw not obstacles but a checklist. This was what his years in the stock exchange had trained him for. Complex systems, multiple moving parts, transactions that required precision and timing. He'd spent his professional life managing complicated financial arrangements. Surely he could apply the same skills to something infinitely more important than money changing hands. He rented a room at the Europa Hotel on Wenceslas Square and transformed it into an office. At a desk by the window overlooking Prague's central boulevard, he established what would become the British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia, Children's Section. The name was deliberately official sounding, designed to convince bureaucrats that this was a proper organization rather than one young stockbroker working from a hotel room. The operation was audacious in its simplicity. Winton placed advertisements in British newspapers asking families to consider fostering Czech refugee children. He corresponded with the Home Office, navigating their requirements. He worked with Martin and other volunteers to process applications from desperate parents in the refugee camps. Every evening after the volunteers left, he sat at that hotel desk working through lists by lamplight. Names, ages, addresses in Prague where families could still be reached, matching children with potential foster families in Britain, calculating costs, writing letters in his careful hand to British officials, to Czech authorities, to foster families, to parents. The parents were the hardest part. They would arrive at the hotel room office throughout the day, clutching documents and photographs of their children. They spoke through translators, their desperation making every language finally the same language. "Save my son. Take my daughter. Please." One mother, Winton would later recall, brought her little boy to meet him. The child was 6 years old, with dark curls and serious eyes. The mother had dressed him in his best clothes for this interview, as though appearance might somehow tip the scales toward salvation. She sat across from Winton's desk and spoke in German, which he understood. "His name is Thomas," she said, her hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "He's very good. He listens. He doesn't make trouble. He can learn English quickly, I know he can. He's smart, my Thomas. He reads already." Winton looked at the boy, who stared back with that same too-knowing expression he'd seen in the camp that first night. Children in Prague were aging rapidly, learning terrible lessons about the world's capacity for cruelty. "I'll do everything I can," Winton told the mother. It was the only promise he could honestly make. Not that he would save Thomas, he couldn't guarantee that, but that he would try with everything he had. The mother nodded, tears running silently down her face. "If you can save him," she said quietly, "then I can bear anything else. If he lives, then I live, even if I die. Do you understand?" He understood. That was perhaps the most terrible part. He understood completely what these parents were offering. They were tearing themselves in half, sending away the pieces of their hearts that mattered most, because keeping those pieces meant watching them destroyed. By January 1939, Winton had a system running, applications processed, foster families identified, financial arrangements made. The first transport was scheduled for March. 100 children on a train that would travel from Prague through Nazi Germany to the Hook of Holland, then by ferry to Britain. But arranging one train was just the beginning. Every day, more families appeared at the hotel room office. Every day, the political situation deteriorated. Hitler's speeches grew more threatening. The Nazi occupation of what remained of Czechoslovakia seemed inevitable and imminent. Every delay meant more children trapped. Winton worked through January, through February, sleeping 4 hours a night, his desk piled with documents and photographs and desperate letters. His mother in London couldn't understand why he'd stayed in Prague so long, why he'd given up his job at the stock exchange, what he was doing in this dangerous city as war clouds gathered. He couldn't quite explain it himself. He only knew that when he closed his eyes he saw those children in the camps, the little girl with the knowing eyes, Thomas, with his serious face, and his mother's desperate love. Hundreds of others whose names he'd written carefully in his ledgers, each one a world he might save or fail to save. The volunteers who worked with him later recalled his intensity during those months. Trevor Chadwick, a British teacher in Prague who helped with the operation, remembered Winton's response when someone suggested that getting all these children out was impossible. "Impossible," Winton had said, not looking up from the list he was writing, "is a word bureaucrats use to avoid work. We're not bureaucrats. We're just going to do what needs doing." In late February, word came through official channels that Germany would soon complete its occupation of Czechoslovakia. Not weeks away, days. The window was closing. If the trains didn't start running immediately, they would never run at all. Winton redoubled his efforts. Telegrams flew between Prague and London. He called in every favour, pressed every contact, used every ounce of influence he'd accumulated in his years in business. When official channels moved too slowly, he found unofficial ones. When bureaucrats said no, he found other bureaucrats who might say yes. On March 14, 1939, Germany invaded what remained of Czechoslovakia. Nazi tanks rolled into Prague. The occupation was complete. The trap had sprung. But on that same day, the first train was ready. 100 children, each clutching a small suitcase, each wearing a tag with an identification number. 100 sets of parents saying goodbye at Wilson Station, knowing with terrible certainty they would never see these children again, but praying desperately that the children would live. Winton stood on the platform as the train prepared to depart. He checked his lists one final time. Every child accounted for, every document in order, every detail managed. The locomotive released steam with a sound like an exhausted sigh. A father approached him, shook his hand, said something in Czech that the translator rendered as, "Thank you for giving us hope." But Winton, watching the train pull slowly away, had felt not triumph but urgency. 100 children saved, but thousands remained. And now, with German soldiers patrolling Prague's streets, every subsequent rescue would be infinitely more dangerous. He returned to the Europa Hotel, to his room that had become a command center for an impossible mission. He sat at his desk and looked at the remaining lists, the names that hadn't made this first transport, the applications still coming in daily. The mathematics of it stretched before him like a mountain too tall to climb. But Nicholas Winton had learned something about himself in these months. He was the kind of man who looked at mountains and began climbing, not because he believed he could reach the summit, but because people were dying on the slopes, and standing still was not an option he could live with. He picked up his pen and began writing the next list. Train 2. 100 more children. 100 more chances. 100 more reasons to keep working through another night while darkness gathered over Europe and time ran out with terrible speed. There is a particular kind of courage required to send children through the heart of darkness, not the courage of soldiers who face danger themselves, but the courage of parents who must place their most precious cargo into hands they've never met and pray that somewhere on the other side of 1,000 miles of Nazi territory, safety waits. Between March and August 1939, 8 trains carried 669 children across that impossible distance. Each journey was a miracle of logistics, forgery, timing, and luck. Each one could have ended in disaster at a dozen different points. That they succeeded at all stands as testimony to human determination operating at the very edge of possibility. Consider what these trains represented. Picture the geography. Prague to London requires travelling west through the very heart of Nazi-controlled Europe, through Bohemia, now part of Hitler's expanded Reich, through Germany proper, where swastikas hung from every government building and SS officers checked papers at every border, through the Netherlands, still neutral but nervous, its own invasion less than a year away, then across the English Channel to Britain, the only place in Europe where these children might find sanctuary. 1,000 miles, 12 to 15 hours by train, every mile taking them deeper into enemy territory before finally emerging on the other side, every border crossing a moment when the entire rescue could unravel, every Nazi guard who looked at their documents a potential executioner if those documents didn't pass inspection. The documents were, of course, largely fraudulent. This is the part of the story that reveals Winton's particular genius. He understood that saving these children required not just compassion but deception. The Nazis wouldn't grant exit permits for Jewish children to escape to Britain. They wanted Jews trapped, contained, eventually eliminated. So the children couldn't travel as what they were. They had to travel as something else. Winton and his volunteers created an elaborate fiction. The children weren't refugees fleeing persecution. They were students travelling to Britain for summer educational programs. They weren't desperate Jewish families' last hope. They were tourists, visiting friends, attending language courses. The forged travel documents created entire alternative realities, complete with fictional schools, fabricated summer camps, invented relatives in Britain eager to host their visiting cousins. Creating these forgeries required skills the volunteers had to learn rapidly. They needed official-looking letterhead, proper stamps, the right kind of paper, signatures that appeared authentic. One tiny mistake, a date in the wrong format, a stamp slightly off-center, an official's name misspelled, could doom an entire transport. The work happened at night, in back rooms, by lamplight. Volunteers bent over desks, carefully copying official seals, practicing signatures, aging new documents to make them look used and legitimate. They were ordinary people, teachers, housewives, office workers, becoming forgers because children's lives required forgery. One volunteer, a Czech woman named Marie, later described the surreal nature of this work. "We would drink tea and forge Nazi transit papers," she recalled. "We would laugh about some silly thing, and then remember that if we made a mistake with these stamps, a child would die." It was the strangest combination of ordinary life and absolute terror. But the forged papers alone weren't enough. Each child also needed proper British entry documentation. This part was legitimate, arranged through official channels with the Home Office in London. Each child required a sponsor family willing to house them. Each required that £50 bond deposited with the government. Each needed a formal guarantee that they wouldn't become financial burdens on the British state. Finding foster families proved both easier and harder than Winton expected. The newspaper advertisements he'd placed received hundreds of responses. British families, reading about the refugee crisis, wanted to help. But matching children with appropriate families required careful work. Age considerations, language skills, religious backgrounds. Some families could take teenagers who'd need minimal supervision. Others wanted young children. Some could afford to house multiple siblings together. Others had room for only one. Winton coordinated all of this from his hotel room in Prague, and, increasingly, through correspondence with his mother Barbara in London. She became his partner in the operation, interviewing potential foster families, visiting homes to verify they were suitable, handling the British side of the paperwork. Between them, they built a system that processed applications, matched children with families, and ensured every legal requirement was met. The financial challenge was substantial. £50 sterling per child, approximately £3,000 in today's money, multiplied by hundreds of children, created a staggering total. Some families could afford to pay their own child's bond, most couldn't. Winton found donors, organised fundraising, occasionally paid bonds himself when no other money could be found. Every pound mattered. Every delay meant a child left behind. By late March, the first train was ready. 100 children, 100 small suitcases containing everything they'd carry into their new lives, 100 sets of forged documents that needed to withstand inspection at multiple Nazi checkpoints. The departure from Prague's Wilson station on March 14, 1939, established patterns that would repeat with each subsequent transport. Parents arrived early, some having travelled days to reach Prague. They dressed their children carefully, wanting them to look their best for whatever awaited them in Britain. Many children wore tags around their necks with identification numbers, like luggage being shipped. The scene on the platform was one of controlled chaos, barely restraining absolute heartbreak. Mothers straightened collars, smoothed hair, gave final instructions about being good, listening to adults, remembering to write letters. Fathers lifted children one more time, held them close, set them down gently as though any sudden movement might shatter something precious. Siblings clung to each other, the older ones trying to be brave for the younger. One of the most painful aspects was that many children didn't fully understand what was happening. The youngest ones thought they were going on an adventure, a holiday. They couldn't grasp that this goodbye might be forever. Parents had to pretend excitement they didn't feel, smile through their terror, make this separation seem normal rather than apocalyptic. Vera Diamantova, 10 years old, later recalled her parents' faces on the platform. My mother kept saying, "You'll have a wonderful time in England." She was smiling, but I could see she was crying at the same time. I didn't understand why she was both smiling and crying. I thought, I'd be back in a few months. I thought this was temporary. The train itself became a vessel of transformation. Children boarded as Czechs, Jews, members of families and communities. They would arrive in Britain as refugees, foreigners, charity cases. Everything familiar would be left behind. Language, culture, food, the sound of their mother's voice, calling them to dinner, the smell of their father's pipe tobacco, every tiny detail that made up the texture of home. As each train departed, volunteers gave the older children instructions. You are travelling to summer camps. If guards ask questions, you're tourists. Don't speak about being Jewish. Don't mention persecution. Hide your Star of David necklaces. Some children, particularly teenagers, understood the precariousness of their situation. They knew they were travelling on false pretenses through enemy territory. Others, younger, simply followed directions without understanding why secrecy mattered so desperately. The journey itself was an ordeal. 12 to 15 hours on trains with minimal food, crossing borders where Nazi guards boarded, walked through compartments, demanded papers. At each checkpoint, volunteers travelling with the children held their breath while documents were inspected. One skeptical guard, one official who looked too closely, one stamp that didn't quite match. Any of these could end the journey. At the German-Dutch border, the scrutiny was particularly intense. This was the Nazis' last chance to stop these children from escaping. Guards spent extra time with the paperwork. They looked at children's faces, comparing them to photograph on documents. They asked questions, listening for inconsistencies. One transport nearly failed when a guard noticed that a teenage girl was wearing a Star of David necklace partially visible beneath her collar. The volunteer, travelling with the children, a young woman named Beatrice, immediately began speaking rapidly in German about summer programs and prom, language courses, distracting the guard while another volunteer quietly signalled the girl to hide the necklace. The moment stretched interminably. Then the guard stamped the papers and moved on. Later, Beatrice would describe that moment as the longest 30 seconds of her life. I could see our entire operation ending right there, all those children sent back to Prague. Or worse, the Nazis investigating further and discovering the whole network of forgeries. I kept talking about educational programs while my heart hammered so hard I thought the guard could hear it. Once across the border into the Netherlands, the danger lessened but didn't disappear. The Dutch were sympathetic but nervous about their own vulnerability. German armies massed at their borders. Their neutrality felt increasingly fragile. Still, they allowed the trains to pass through. The children changed trains in the Netherlands, travelling to the Hook of Holland where ferries waited to carry them across the English Channel. The ferry crossings presented their own challenges. Many children had never seen the sea. Some became seasick. Others were simply exhausted from the journey, from the emotional trauma of separation, from the cumulative stress of travelling through hostile territory. The volunteers travelling with them tried to comfort, to reassure, to maintain order among groups of frightened children who spoke a language most British volunteers couldn't understand. Finally, Liverpool Street Station in London. This was where the journeys ended and new lives began. Foster families waited on the platform, holding signs with names, searching faces for the children they'd agreed to take into their homes. It was a strange, awkward dance of connection. Parents choosing children like selecting from a catalogue, children being inspected, evaluated, claimed or passed over. Some matches worked beautifully. Families embraced their foster children with genuine warmth. They'd prepared rooms, bought new clothes, learned basic Czech phrases to make the children feel welcome. These foster parents understood they were receiving traumatized refugees who needed patience and love. Other matches were more difficult. Some families had volunteered for what they thought were charitable reasons, but didn't understand the reality of housing a child from a completely different culture who didn't speak English and was grieving everything they'd lost. Some families expected gratitude and were frustrated when traumatized children acted out. Some saw the children as cheap domestic labor, taking in foster children to help with housework. Kurt Fuchel, who arrived on the second transport at age 14, later described his first night with his foster family. They'd given him a room in the attic, small but clean. They'd served dinner, food he didn't recognize, flavors completely foreign to him. They'd spoken to him in slow, loud English, as though volume could overcome the language barrier. They were kind people, he would later realize. But that first night, alone in an attic room in a strange country, unable to communicate, separated from his parents by 1,000 miles of Nazi territory, he cried into his pillow, trying to stay quiet so his new hosts wouldn't hear. This scene repeated 669 times across the 8 successful transports. 669 children making similar journeys. 669 individuals experiencing their own versions of separation, fear, hope, and dislocation. The logistics of organizing these 8 transports consumed every moment of Winton's time between March and August. Each new train required the entire cycle of paperwork, forgeries, foster family matches, and funding to repeat. The challenges didn't become easier with practice. If anything, they intensified. After the first transport, Nazi authorities grew more suspicious. Border checks became more thorough. The political situation deteriorated further. In May, Winton had to return to London. He couldn't abandon his life indefinitely. He had financial obligations. His mother couldn't manage the British side of the operation alone. But leaving Prague felt like abandoning the work. There were still thousands of children waiting. Still parents appearing at what had been his hotel room office, now managed by volunteers, begging for spaces on future transports. From London, Winton continued coordinating rescues. He worked a full day at a new position he'd secured in business, then spent evenings managing the transport lists, corresponding with volunteers in Prague, arranging foster placements, securing funding. Sleep became something he did for a few hours before dawn. Food became fuel consumed without tasting. His entire existence narrowed to a single question: how many more children can we save before time runs out? Train 2 departed in late March, Train 3 in early April, 4, 5, 6 through May and June, 7 in July. With each successful transport, Winton's confidence grew. They'd proven the system worked. They'd moved hundreds of children through the heart of Nazi territory without major incident. Each train that reached Britain safely suggested the next one could succeed as well. But confidence is dangerous when operating at the edge of possible. Each success made the operation bolder: larger trains, tighter schedules, taking more risks because previous risks had paid off. The volunteers began to believe they could beat the odds indefinitely, that their system was secure enough to withstand anything. They were wrong. But that realization was still weeks away. By the end of July 1939, 669 children had reached Britain safely. 669 miracles of logistics, timing, and fortune. 669 children who would grow up, have families, build lives, contribute to the world in ways that multiplied Winton's act exponentially. But the mathematics of rescue has a terrible reverse side. For every child saved, several more couldn't be accommodated. The trains had finite capacity. Foster families, however generous, could only take so many children. Money ran out. Time ran out. For every name written on Winton's successful transport lists, a dozen other names remained in the desperate applications piled on his desk. He would carry those names for the rest of his life. The children he couldn't save, the parents whose pleas he had to refuse, not because he didn't care, not because he didn't try, but because one person, working with limited resources against impossible obstacles, can only do so much. Yet even saying only in this context seems obscene. 669 lives. 669 children who existed in the world because one man cancelled a skiing holiday and decided that impossible was simply a word bureaucrats used to avoid work. As August arrived and summer began its slow turn toward autumn, Winton worked on his most ambitious transport yet. Train 9. 250 children. More than twice the size of any previous transport. It would require perfect coordination, maximum efficiency, every lesson learned from previous journeys applied flawlessly. The departure was scheduled for September 1st, 1939. The children were selected, the foster families arranged, the documents prepared, everything was ready. What wasn't ready was the world. But that catastrophe was still hours away. There are moments in history when everything pivots, when the careful plans of good people collide with the brutal machinery of evil, when all the logistics and preparation and hope mean nothing against the simple fact of tanks crossing borders. September 1st, 1939 was such a moment. 250 children woke that morning in homes across Prague and its surrounding regions. They dressed carefully, as their parents instructed. Best clothes for the journey, warm coat even, though summer hadn't fully ended, because Britain would be cold and they needed to make good impressions on their new foster families. Small suitcase packed with everything they could carry into their new lives. Everything precious had to fit. One favourite doll, one book, one photograph of mother and father, one small toy that smelled like home. Parents helped their children choose, knowing these objects would be their only tangible connections to the world they were leaving. Choose carefully. Choose what matters most. Choose what might comfort you when you're alone and frightened and missing everything you've ever known. At Wilson Station, the platform filled with families saying goodbye. The same scene that had played out 8 times before. The same embraces, the same whispered promises to write letters, the same parents trying to smile while their hearts shattered. But this time, something felt different. The air carried tension beyond the normal sorrow of separation. News had reached Prague overnight. German armies were massing at the Polish border. Hitler's demands on Poland had reached their crescendo. The diplomatic situation, already precarious, had become critical. Some parents arriving at the station wondered if they should proceed. If their children should travel today, of all days, when Europe teetered on the edge of war. But what choice did they have? The transport was scheduled, the documents were prepared. The foster families in Britain waited, and every day of delay meant another day their children remained in Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia, where Jewish children's futures had already been decided by authorities who saw them as problems to be eliminated rather than lives to be protected. So the families gathered, the children lined up, the volunteers checked papers one final time. Everything was in order. 250 children, the largest single transport Winton had organised. If successful, it would prove the system could handle even bigger operations, maybe 300 children next time, maybe more. Maybe they could accelerate the pace, empty the refugee camps faster, save more of the thousands still waiting. The train sat at the platform, steam rising from its engine. Luggage was loaded, children found their seats. The older ones helped the younger ones settle, acting as temporary parents to frightened 6-year-olds making this journey alone. Through the windows, final waves, final blown kisses, final moments of seeing mother's face, father's hand raised in farewell. Then, before the train could depart, word reached the station. Germany had invaded Poland. That morning, at 4:45, German forces had crossed the border in overwhelming force. Tanks, infantry, aircraft. The invasion everyone had feared, everyone had expected, everyone had hoped somehow might still be avoided. And with the invasion came immediate consequences. All borders sealed, all international travel suspended. No trains would cross from Czechoslovakia into Germany. Not today, not tomorrow, not until further notice, which everyone understood meant not ever again. The children sat in their train car unaware. Outside on the platform, volunteers received the news with sickening comprehension. This transport wouldn't depart. These 250 children wouldn't reach Britain today. Maybe not ever. The decision had to be made quickly. Tell the children now, while they're still on the train, or ask parents to take them home and explain later, more gently, in familiar surroundings. The volunteers chose the latter. One by one, families were called. Come, retrieve your child. The transport is cancelled. Take them home. Imagine being a parent in that moment. You'd already said goodbye. You'd already torn yourself in half, sending away the piece of your heart that mattered most because keeping them meant condemning them. You'd already walked away from the platform, forcing yourself not to look back because looking back would make the pain unbearable. You'd already begun the terrible process of learning to live with absence, with the hope that absence meant their survival. And now, hours later, a volunteer finds you and says your child won't be leaving after all. Come back to the station. Take them home. Is it relief you feel first, or despair? Your child is still with you, yes. But still with you means still in danger, still in Nazi-occupied territory, still on the lists that would, within months, begin designating Jewish children for deportation to camps where children didn't survive. The parents returned to Wilson Station. They collected their confused children. Some families wept with relief at this temporary reprieve. Others wept with despair at what it represented. The window had closed. The escape route had shut. Their children would not reach safety. 250 small suitcases were retrieved from the luggage car. 250 carefully packed collections of precious objects. 250 sets of documents that were now meaningless pieces of paper. All the forgeries, all the foster family arrangements, all the planning, rendered void in a single morning by Hitler's decision to invade Poland. Winton, in London, received the news by telephone. He stood in his office, receiver in hand, listening to the volunteer in Prague explain what had happened. The train that never departed. The children sent home. The borders sealed. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, very quietly, he asked the volunteer to preserve all the documentation. Keep the lists. Keep the names. Keep everything. When the war ended, these records would matter. These children would need proof of what had been attempted on their behalf. But both Winton and the volunteer understood what went unspoken. When the war ended, most of these children would be dead. The historical record would show what had been attempted. It wouldn't change what actually happened. Of the 250 children scheduled for that 9th transport, historical records confirm that nearly all perished in Nazi concentration camps. Some died at Auschwitz, others at Treblinka. Some in Theresienstadt, the camp the Nazis cynically called a model ghetto while using it as a way station to death. The children whose names appeared on Winton's list for Train 9 disappeared into the machinery of genocide. We know some of their names. Hanna Bradyova, 13 years old. Otto Klein, 11. Vera Nathova, 8. These aren't abstractions. These were children with favourite foods and playground games and dreams about growing up. Children who died because they were born Jewish in the wrong decade, in the wrong part of Europe, at the wrong moment in history. The cruelty is in the timing. If Train 9 had departed one day earlier, 250 more children would have reached Britain. 250 more would have survived. The margin between life and death came down to hours. A single day's difference. The accident of invasion timing. But this is also the margin on which all rescue operates. The 669 children who did escape succeeded by similarly narrow margins. Different luck with border guards. Different timing with invasions. The space between salvation and destruction is often paper-thin. In the years after the war, Winton kept the list of Train 9's passengers in his scrapbook. Their names, their ages, the word cancelled, written beside each one. He couldn't save them, but he could remember them. He could preserve evidence that they had existed, that they had almost escaped, that in some other version of history where Hitler delayed his invasion by 24 hours, they would have lived. The parents who'd retrieved their children from Wilson Station that September morning faced impossible years ahead. Some found ways to survive in hiding. A few escaped through other routes. Most didn't. They went into ghettos, into camps, into mass graves. One mother, who'd packed her daughter's suitcase so carefully that morning, who'd chosen which doll could go to England and which had to stay behind, who'd kissed her daughter goodbye and then hello again hours later, wrote a letter to Winton months afterward. The letter, preserved in his records, is heartbreaking in its restraint. "You tried," she wrote. "That is more than most people did. You gave us hope for one morning. I will remember the kindness even though the outcome is what it is. Please know you did everything possible. The failure is not yours. The failure belongs to the world that let this happen." The train that never departed haunted Winton for the rest of his life. Even as he took pride in the 669 children he saved, he carried the weight of the 250 he didn't. Success and failure lived together in his memory. Inseparable. This is the mathematics of rescue during genocide. You save who you can. You fail to save many more. Both facts are true simultaneously. The 669 children who lived because of Winton's actions represent an extraordinary achievement. The 250 who died despite his best efforts represent an extraordinary tragedy. We honour the saved without forgetting the lost. We celebrate the trains that reached Britain while remembering the train that never left. History requires holding both realities together, acknowledging that even in stories of remarkable heroism, the scope of evil was so vast that heroism could only ever be partial. September 1st, 1939, marked the end of the Kindertransport from Czechoslovakia. No more trains would run, no more children would escape. The 669 who'd made it to Britain were the final count. The last children to slip through before the trap sealed completely. They would grow up as the lucky ones, the survivors, the ones whose parents' sacrifice worked. But they would also grow up carrying a particular burden, the knowledge that their survival had been purchased by their parents' suffering, that their lives continued while their families perished, that they were, in some sense, living not just their own lives but the lives of all those other children who didn't make it onto those trains. In his London office, Winton filed away the documentation for Train 9. He labelled the folder carefully, noting the date, the number of children, the reason for cancellation. Then he placed it in the same scrapbook that contained all the successful transports. The war was just beginning. It would be 6 years before the full scope of Nazi atrocities became clear. 6 years before the world learned words like Holocaust and genocide. 6 years before anyone knew that the estimates of Jewish deaths would reach 6 million. But Winton already understood enough. He knew that the 250 children on Train 9 represented a tragedy that was simultaneously unique and universal. Unique in its specific details. Universal in the way it mirrored what was happening to millions across Europe. One train that never left. 250 lives that ended in camps. The mathematics of one day's difference between salvation and destruction. This is what haunts the margins of every rescue story. The knowledge that for everyone saved, someone else wasn't. The unbearable calculus of limited resources against unlimited need. Seeds planted in darkness still grow toward light. This is true in gardens and true in human lives. The 669 children who reached Britain in 1939 were seeds planted in foreign soil, carrying within them the potential for entire forests of life that would never have existed if not for one man's choice to act. But for 50 years, those seeds grew without knowing who had planted them. The children became adults, had careers, built families, contributed to the world in countless ways. And through all those decades, Nicholas Wintons, the name meant nothing to them. They knew they'd been rescued. They knew they'd arrived on Kindertransport trains from Prague. But the specific man who'd organised those transports, who'd forged documents and arranged foster families and worked through nights to save them, remained unknown. This is perhaps the most remarkable part of the story. Not just that Winton saved 669 children, but that he did so, and then disappeared completely from their awareness. He didn't seek them out after the war, didn't write memoirs, didn't give interviews about his heroic actions. He simply returned to ordinary life and let them grow up free of any obligation to him. Consider what these children endured. They arrived in Britain as refugees, speaking little or no English, traumatized by separation from their families. The youngest was 6 years old, placed with strangers in a foreign country. The oldest were teenagers, old enough to understand fully what they'd lost but young enough to still need parenting. Some foster families welcomed them with genuine love. These children, despite their trauma, found new homes in the truest sense. They learned English, adapted to British culture, built relationships with foster parents who treated them as their own. These were the lucky ones within the already lucky. Others faced harder paths. Some foster families had volunteered for the wrong reasons, wanting domestic help, seeking charitable credit, or simply not understanding the reality of housing traumatized refugee children. Some children were moved between multiple foster homes, never quite fitting anywhere. Some faced prejudice, both as foreigners and as Jews during a time when anti-Semitism existed even in Britain. Vera Gissing arrived on one of Winton's trains when she was 10 years old. She would later write extensively about her experiences. Her foster family in Liverpool treated her kindly, but couldn't truly understand what she was going through. How could they? They hadn't lost everyone they loved. They hadn't been torn from their language, their culture, their entire world. Vera learned English quickly. Children do. Within months, she sounded British, acted British, seemed British. But inside, she carried Prague with her. She carried the memory of her parents' faces on the platform. She carried the question that haunted all the Kindertransport children. Are they still alive? For years during the war, the children didn't know their parents' fates. Letters stopped arriving. The Red Cross couldn't track people who'd been sent to camps. So the children lived in terrible suspension, hoping desperately that silence meant safety rather than death. After the war ended, truth arrived, slowly and brutally. Most parents hadn't survived. The children, now teenagers or young adults, learned they were orphans, that their parents' choice to send them away had been prescient, that the goodbye at Wilson Station had been final. This knowledge shaped them profoundly. They'd survived, yes, but at what cost? Their existence meant their parents had died alone, without their children beside them. Survivor's guilt became a constant companion. Why them? Why had they lived when millions, including their own families, had perished? Yet they built lives anyway. This is the remarkable resilience of human beings, particularly those forced to develop resilience young. The children grew up. They pursued educations. They found careers. They married, had children of their own, became grandparents. They contributed to British society in extraordinary ways. Joe Schlesinger became one of Canada's most respected broadcast journalists, serving as the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's chief political correspondent. His reports shaped how generations of Canadians understood world events. His career in truth-telling perhaps reflected what he'd learned young about the importance of bearing witness. Lady Milena Grenfell Baines became a renowned architect and dedicated her later years to Holocaust education, ensuring that what happened to European Jews wouldn't be forgotten. She understood that memory was resistance against those who would deny or minimize genocide. Vera Gissing, who'd arrived at 10 years old clutching a small suitcase, became an acclaimed author and translator. She wrote multiple books about her experiences, preserving the story of the Kindertransport children. Her writing kept faith with those who didn't survive, giving voice to the lost. Others became doctors, teachers, scientists, artists, business owners. They raised children who became productive members of society. Those children had children. By 1988, when Greta Winton found the scrapbook, the 669 original children had produced approximately 6,000 descendants. Think about that. Mathematics. 6,000 people existing because 669 children were saved. Every one of those 6,000 individuals living their lives, contributing their talents, having their own children, the ripple effects of rescue spreading across generations. But during all those years, through all those achievements and families and lives well lived, the name Nicholas Winton meant nothing to them. They knew they'd been Kindertransport children. They knew someone had organized their rescue, but the specific identity of their rescuer remained unknown. Winton, for his part, never tried to contact them. After the war ended and the full scope of the Holocaust became clear, he could have sought them out. He had their names, their foster family placements. He could have written to them, introduced himself, claimed credit for saving their lives. He didn't. He simply continued his ordinary life. He married Greta in 1948. They had 3 daughters. He worked in business. He involved himself in various charitable causes. He gardened. He aged gracefully into retirement. Through all of it, the scrapbook sat in the attic, untouched. Why such silence? In later interviews, after his secret was revealed, people asked him repeatedly, "Why never mention it?" His answers were characteristically modest. It hadn't seemed important. Everyone did what they could during the war. He'd simply done his small part. But there's perhaps a deeper truth in his silence. Winton understood something profound about rescue. The children didn't owe him anything. He hadn't saved them so they'd be grateful. He'd saved them so they could live. Their successful lives, their accomplishments, their families. These were their own achievements, not his. To claim credit would be to diminish their agency, to suggest their lives were somehow his gift rather than their own creation. So, he let them grow in secret soil, unknown and unacknowledged. He let them believe they'd survived through some combination of luck and institutional Kindertransport efforts. He let them build identities free from the burden of overwhelming gratitude. This might be the truest form of altruism, not the kind that seeks recognition, but the kind that specifically avoids it. Not rescuing someone so they'll thank you, but rescuing them and then stepping back so completely that they never even know your name. The children scattered across Britain and eventually the world. Some stayed in Britain permanently. Others emigrated to Israel, America, Canada, Australia. They became part of the Jewish diaspora, part of the broader community of Holocaust survivors, part of families and neighborhoods wherever they landed. They formed organizations for Kindertransport survivors, gathering to share memories and experiences. At these gatherings, they would talk about their rescue, their gratitude for the program that saved them. But they spoke of it as a collective effort, an institutional achievement. The British government's willingness to accept refugee children, the various Jewish organizations that helped with logistics, the foster families who took them in. Individual names rarely came up. Who remembers the specific bureaucrats who processed their paperwork? Who knows the names of volunteers who arranged foster placements? The machinery of rescue was mostly anonymous to those rescued, and so Nicholas Winton remained anonymous too. Just another cog in that machinery. Just someone who'd helped somehow, somewhere, in ways the children never fully understood. Until Greta climbed into the attic in 1988. Until she found the scrapbook. Until she confronted Nicholas with the evidence of what he'd done and decided that this silence had gone on long enough. She understood something Nicholas perhaps didn't, that while he had no obligation to tell his story, the children he'd saved might want to know that gratitude isn't a burden when offered freely, that knowing who saved you doesn't diminish your own achievements but rather adds a layer of connection to the web of human kindness that makes survival possible. The 669 children were now in their late 50s and 60s. They'd lived full lives, raised families, built careers, but they'd also carried questions. Who organized my transport? Who forged my documents? Who matched me with my foster family? Who saved my life? For 50 years, those questions had no specific answers. The machinery of rescue remained mysterious. Anonymous volunteers, unnamed organizers, faceless bureaucrats who somehow, miraculously, got them out of Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia and into Britain before the trap sealed completely. Now, finally, those questions were about to receive answers. The anonymous rescuer was about to get a name. The 669 children who'd grown in secret soil were about to discover who planted them there. And Nicholas Winton, who'd kept silent for half a century, was about to learn what it feels like when 669 people discover they owe their lives to you, when the secret you've carried privately becomes public knowledge, when the ordinary life you've lived reveals itself to have extraordinary foundations. The seeds he planted in darkness were about to meet their gardener, and the forest those seeds had become, the thousands of descendants, the accomplishments, the ripple effects of rescue spreading across generations, was about to acknowledge its roots. There are moments when television transcends entertainment and becomes witness to something sacred, when the medium designed for distraction instead captures genuine human emotion in its rawest form, when millions watching at home suddenly find themselves part of something larger than programming. February 1988, on BBC's That's Life, was such a moment. Esther Rantzen, the show's host, had received a letter from Greta Winton. After discovering the scrapbook, after learning her husband's secret, Greta had decided the story needed telling. Not for Nicholas's sake, he remained reluctant about any publicity, but for the sake of the children he'd saved, most of whom still didn't know his name. Rantzen recognized immediately the power of what she'd been given. This wasn't just an interesting historical footnote. This was a love story between a rescuer and the rescued who'd never met. This was 669 lives connected to one man through invisible threads of salvation. This was television gold, yes, but more importantly, it was profoundly human, she planned carefully. The show would invite Nicholas Winton as a guest, ostensibly to discuss his wartime work in a general way. He'd agreed reluctantly, uncomfortable with attention, but willing to honor his wife's wishes. He had no idea what Rantzen had actually planned. She'd tracked down as many of the rescued children as possible. Now, in their 50s and 60s, spread across Britain and the world, these survivors learned for the first time the name of the man who'd organized their escape, the man who'd forged their documents, the man who'd worked through nights to save them. Many wept learning his identity. Vera Gissing, contacted by the BBC, couldn't speak for several minutes after hearing Winton's name. This person she'd never heard of had given her everything. Her life, her children, her grandchildren. All of it existed because Nicholas Winton had cancelled a skiing holiday 50 years ago. The BBC asked them to come to the studio for the taping. Come meet your rescuer. Come thank the man who saved you. Many couldn't attend. They lived too far away, had health issues, couldn't travel on short notice. But dozens could come. Dozens wanted desperately to come. On the night of the taping, Nicholas Winton arrived at the BBC studio with no idea he was walking into an ambush. He wore a suit, looking every bit the proper British gentleman. 79 years old, still trim and dignified, his white hair carefully combed, his manner modest and slightly uncomfortable with the whole proceeding. The studio audience filled in around him. He noticed they seemed older than typical television audiences, more formal somehow, but he didn't recognize any faces. Why would he? The last time he'd seen these children, they'd been young refugees with frightened eyes, not prosperous British adults in their 60s. Rantzen began the interview conventionally. She asked about his work in Prague, about the trains, about the children. Winton answered in his characteristically understated way. He'd helped organize some transports. Others had done the real work. He'd just managed paperwork mostly. As he spoke, the camera occasionally cut to audience members. Their faces showed emotion Winton couldn't interpret from his seat. Some were crying silently. Others gripped armrests with white-knuckled intensity. They weren't watching a television interview. They were looking at their own personal miracle made flesh. Then Rantzen asked a question that seemed simple. Is there anyone in our audience tonight who owes their life to Nicholas Winton? A woman sitting directly beside Winton stood up. Then another. Behind him. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire studio audience was standing, every single person, all of them looking at him with expressions of gratitude so profound it transcended words. The camera captured Winton's face in that moment, confusion giving way to comprehension, comprehension giving way to emotion. This proper British gentleman, who'd kept silent for 50 years, suddenly understanding that he was surrounded by the children he'd saved, that every person standing represented a life he'd altered, that the secret he'd carried privately had suddenly become unbearably public. He looked around the studio, his composure crumbling. Tears began streaming down his face. Not polite tears either. Deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere beyond conscious control. 50 years of carried silence breaking open in a single moment. The woman sitting beside him, whom he hadn't recognized, leaned over and embraced him. She was crying too. "I'm Vera Gissing," she said through tears. "You saved my life. You saved all of us." The studio dissolved into collective weeping. The camera crew, the producers, Ranson herself. Everyone watching this proper elderly gentleman break down as he realized what his silence had hidden. That he wasn't just a man who'd done some minor good 50 years ago. He was a man who'd created 669 universes of possibility, who'd given thousands of descendants the chance to exist, who'd changed the fundamental architecture of reality for hundreds of families. Television doesn't often capture genuine moments. Most emotion on screen is performed, scripted, designed for effect. But this was real in a way that transcended production. This was a man confronting the full weight of his own actions. This was the rescued finally able to thank their rescuer. This was love made visible. The audience members began sharing their stories. A man stood and said Winton's actions meant he'd been able to become a doctor, save other lives, have children who were now saving lives themselves. A woman said she'd named her daughter after the foster mother Winton had arranged for her, keeping alive the chain of kindness. Another man simply said, "My grandchildren exist because of you. How do I thank you for my grandchildren?" Winton couldn't answer. He could barely breathe through his tears. This wasn't what he'd wanted. He'd kept silent specifically to avoid this moment. But now, surrounded by the evidence of what his actions meant, he couldn't maintain that protective distance anymore. The broadcast ended with the image of Winton surrounded by the people he'd saved, all of them embracing him, thanking him, celebrating him. When it aired, the response was overwhelming. The BBC received thousands of letters. Newspapers picked up the story. Television stations across the world requested copies of the footage. Nicholas Winton, who'd spent 50 years as an anonymous pensioner, suddenly became internationally famous. The man who'd sought no recognition found himself receiving honours from multiple countries. The story he tried to bury became the defining narrative of his life. But something else happened too. Something perhaps more important than fame. The 669 children finally had a name to attach to their salvation. They could finally thank someone specific. They could finally express gratitude that had been building for 50 years with nowhere to go. Letters poured into the Winton home, from the rescued children now elderly themselves, from their children and grandchildren, from people who'd been moved by the story and wanted to express admiration. Each letter represented a life touched, a connection made, a recognition that individual actions matter even when kept secret. Vera Gissing became close with Winton after that broadcast. He visited him regularly, bringing her family to meet the man who'd made their existence possible. She'd spent her whole life wondering who organized her transport. Now, she knew. And knowing didn't diminish her own achievements, but rather added context to them. She'd survived because someone cared enough to act. That knowledge was a gift, not a burden. Other rescued children sought him out as well. They came to his home in Maidenhead, bringing photographs of their families. "These are your grandchildren too," one woman told him, showing pictures of her descendants. "You're part of our family now, whether you want to be or not." Winton adapted slowly to his new fame. He gave interviews, though he remained uncomfortable with praise. He attended ceremonies honoring his work. He met with rescued children whenever they wished. But he always deflected credit, always insisted others had done more, always seemed slightly bewildered that people made such a fuss about something he'd done half a century ago. The BBC broadcast changed everything. It transformed secret history into public knowledge. It gave the rescued their rescuer's name. It showed the world what one person acting with courage and organisation could accomplish. But perhaps most importantly, it gave Nicholas Winton something he hadn't known he needed: the chance to see what his silence had hidden, to understand the full scope of what his actions meant, to be embraced, literally and figuratively, by the evidence of his own goodness. That moment when the studio audience stood, that image of an old man surrounded by the lives he'd saved, became one of the most iconic pieces of footage in television history. It's been shown countless times, in documentaries and classrooms and museums, each viewing carrying the same emotional punch, because what we're watching in that moment isn't just one man's story. We're watching proof that individual actions ripple through time, that courage matters, that choosing to act, rather than remain passive, changes the fundamental structure of reality, that one person really can make a difference, even when that difference stays hidden for 50 years. Nicholas Winton left that studio a changed man. The protective silence he'd maintained was gone, stripped away by love ambushing him in the form of 669 standing ovations. He would spend his remaining years, nearly 2 more decades, living with his secret made public, and he would discover that being known as a hero, while uncomfortable, carried unexpected joys. The embrace of those he'd saved, the gratitude of their families, the knowledge that his life had mattered in the most literal sense possible. That because he'd acted, thousands of people existed who otherwise wouldn't. The ambush of love that night at the BBC had revealed what Winton tried to hide. But in revealing it, it also gave back something precious: connection, recognition, the visible proof that silence had hidden. That goodness multiplies, that rescue echoes through generations. That one person cancelling a skiing holiday can change the world. The Talmud teaches that whoever saves one life saves the world entire. Nicholas Winton lived long enough to see this ancient wisdom proven mathematically. He saved 669 children. Those children produced approximately 6,000 descendants by the time of his death. 6,000 worlds. 6,000 entire universes of possibility that exist because one man chose action over comfort. After the BBC broadcast in 1988, Winton's final decades became a study in how late recognition transforms a life. He was 79 when his secret emerged. He would live another 27 years, reaching the remarkable age of 106. Those final years allowed him to witness the full flowering of seeds he'd planted in 1939. The honours came steadily. In 1993, Queen Elizabeth awarded him the Member of the British Empire. He accepted it with characteristic modesty, noting that many others deserved recognition more than he did. In 2003, she knighted him, making him Sir Nicholas Winton. At 94 years old, he knelt before his monarch and rose as Sir Nicholas, a title that felt absurd to him but which others insisted he'd earned 50 times over. The Czech Republic claimed him as a hero as well, though he'd been British his entire life. In 2014, they awarded him the Order of the White Lion, the nation's highest honour. Czech President Miloš Zeman presented the award personally, calling Winton one of the greatest heroes of the 20th century. Winton, at 105 years old, accepted with the same humble grace he'd shown throughout his late-life celebrity. But perhaps more meaningful than official honours were the personal connections. The rescued children, now elderly themselves, maintained relationships with him until his death. Vera Gissing visited regularly, bringing news of her family, sharing stories of her grandchildren. She'd made it her mission to ensure Winton's story reached as many people as possible, giving speeches, writing books, appearing in documentaries. Other rescued children travelled from across the world to meet him. They came from Israel, where many had emigrated, from America, where others had built lives, from Australia, Canada, across Europe. They came to shake his hand, embrace him, show him photographs of their families. "This is what you made possible," they would say, pointing to children and grandchildren in the photos. "This is what your courage created." Winton received these visits with genuine warmth but also continuing discomfort with praise. "I just did what was needed," he would say repeatedly. "Anyone would have done the same." But of course, that wasn't true. Many people had seen the same refugee crisis in 1939. Most had done nothing. Some had helped in small ways. Only Winton had cancelled his holiday, set up an office in a hotel room, forged documents, arranged foster families, and systematically organized 8 successful transports. His story became a template for understanding individual moral action. Schools taught about the Winton transports as examples of what citizens can accomplish when institutions fail. Holocaust museums featured his story prominently, showing how rescue was possible even under Nazi occupation. His life became proof that "I couldn't do anything" is often really "I chose not to try." Documentaries proliferated. Nicholas Winton, The Power of Good, Nicky's Family, and numerous others explored his actions and their consequences. Filmmakers interviewed the rescued children, now in their 70s and 80s, capturing their testimonies before that generation passed. These films ensured the story would survive beyond living memory, preserved for generations not yet born. Statues commemorated his work. At Prague's main station, a bronze statue shows Winton surrounded by refugee children. At London's Liverpool Street Station, another statue depicts him sitting on a bench, a small suitcase beside him representing all the children who passed through that station on their way to new lives. Visitors sit beside the statue, take photographs, leave flowers. The bronze Winton has become a site of pilgrimage. The rescued children and their descendants formed organizations to preserve the story and honor Winton's legacy. They established scholarships in his name. They funded Holocaust education programs. They ensured that every year, on the anniversary of the first transport, ceremonies remembered both the children saved and those who perished on the train that never left. As Winton aged into his 90s and then past 100, he became a living link to history that was rapidly slipping from living memory. The Holocaust survivors were dying. The generation that fought World War II was disappearing. Winton represented something increasingly rare, direct connection to that pivotal moment when civilization nearly destroyed itself. Journalists sought him out for this reason. What was it like in 1939? What did Prague feel like as the Nazis closed in? How did you find the courage to act? His answers remained consistent across hundreds of interviews. It hadn't felt like courage, it had felt like obvious necessity. Children needed saving. No one was saving them. So he did. This simplicity was part of his power as a symbol. He didn't claim to be special. He didn't present himself as uniquely brave or gifted. He was, in his telling, an ordinary person who saw a problem and addressed it methodically. This made his story accessible. If Nicholas Winton was ordinary, then ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things. The mathematics of his rescue continued multiplying. By 2010, estimates suggested the 669 children had produced over 7,000 descendants. By 2015, when Winton died, that number approached 8,000. Each year added more births, more lives cascading from his original choice. Think about what those numbers represent. 8,000 people living full lives, 8,000 individuals contributing to society. Among them, doctors saving other lives, teachers educating children, artists creating beauty, scientists advancing knowledge. Among them, good parents raising good children. Among them, people performing small daily kindnesses that ripple outward in ways impossible to measure. All of this, every single bit of it, traces back to one man cancelling a skiing trip, to one hotel room transformed into a rescue office, to one person willing to forge documents and navigate bureaucracy and work through nights because children were dying and someone needed to act. This is the mathematics of one good man, not just the 669 children directly saved, not just the 8,000 descendants, but the immeasurable ripple effects spreading through time. Every life those 8,000 people touched, every person helped by the doctors among them, every student taught by the teachers, every patient comforted by the nurses, every client served by the lawyers and business people and tradesmen. The ripples continue spreading. They'll never stop. As long as those bloodlines persist, as long as descendants of Winton's children have children of their own, the mathematics keeps multiplying. In 500 years, genetic modelling suggests nearly every person of European descent might carry DNA from someone Winton saved. His choice in 1939 could literally reshape the human gene pool. But beyond genetics, there's the story itself, the proof it provides that individual action matters. How many people, hearing about Nicholas Winton, decided to act on their own moral impulses? How many chose courage over comfort, action over paralysis, engagement over apathy? How many lives were saved or improved because Winton's example inspired others? These questions have no precise answers, but they suggest the true mathematics of his life extend far beyond direct descendants. He saved 669 children, but he also saved something else. The belief that one person can make a difference, the conviction that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things, the proof that silence and inaction are choices, not inevitabilities. Nicholas Winton died on July 1st, 2015, at the age of 106. He'd lived long enough to see the 20th century end and the 21st begin, long enough to witness the Cold War's conclusion, the Internet's rise, the transformation of the world he'd been born into beyond recognition. He died peacefully, in his sleep, surrounded by family. His daughters were with him. Greta, his beloved wife who'd discovered the scrapbook, had passed several years earlier, but her choice to reveal his secret had given him these final decades of recognition and connection. The obituaries appeared in newspapers worldwide. Hero who saved hundreds of children dies at 106. The BBC replayed the footage of that emotional broadcast where the studio audience stood. Television stations aired documentaries about his life. Social media filled with tributes from people who'd never met him but whose lives his story had touched. At his funeral, the rescued children came to say goodbye. Now in their 80s, many with health challenges of their own, they travelled to pay respects. Vera Gissing delivered a eulogy. She spoke of the little girl who'd arrived in Britain not knowing who'd saved her. She spoke of the woman who'd learned his name 50 years later. She spoke of the decades of friendship that followed. And she spoke for all the rescued children when she said simply, "We owe him everything." The Czech and British governments sent representatives. The Israeli ambassador attended. Holocaust survivors from across Europe came to honour a man who'd shown that rescue was possible, that ordinary people could resist evil effectively, that bureaucracy could be navigated and borders crossed and children saved, if someone cared enough to try. But perhaps the most powerful moment came at the end of the service. As mourners filed out, a photographer captured an image that would spread across the internet. 6,000 descendants of Winton's rescued children, or as many as could attend, gathered outside the church. 6,000 people standing together. 6,000 lives, 6,000 worlds entire. The photograph made the mathematics visible. This vast crowd existed because one man acted. Every face in that crowd represented an entire universe of possibility, dreams and talents, and future children, and contributions to humanity. All of it traceable to a single choice made 76 years earlier. Nicholas Winton's life proves several truths we often doubt. That one person can change the world. That ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage. That the effects of our choices ripple through time in ways we can barely imagine. That keeping secrets doesn't diminish good deeds, but that revealing them can inspire others to similar action. His life also proves something darker but equally important. That rescue was possible during the Holocaust. That children could have been saved if more people had acted. That the 6 million who died didn't perish because rescue was impossible, but because too few people attempted it. This is perhaps Winton's most challenging legacy. He shows us what was possible, which means he shows us what wasn't done. For every child he saved, thousands more could have been saved if others had made similar efforts. His success throws into stark relief everyone else's failure to act. But rather than using this truth to judge the past, perhaps we should use it to inform the present. Right now, in our time, children are suffering. Refugees flee violence. Injustice operates openly. Evil advances while good people remain passive. The question Winton's life poses isn't just, what did people do in 1939? It's, What are we doing now? When you stand beneath the statue of Nicholas Winton at Liverpool Street Station, you see a man sitting peacefully beside a small suitcase, bronze and permanent. But if you close your eyes, you might imagine what that statue represents: 669 children passing through this station. 669 chances at life, 8,000 descendants and counting. And you might ask yourself the question Winton's life poses to every generation. When you see suffering, do you act? When systems fail, do you create new ones? When evil advances, do you resist? When no one else is solving a problem, do you solve it yourself? Nicholas Winton's answer to these questions changed the world. 8,000 times over, his answer created worlds that wouldn't otherwise exist. His mathematics proves the Talmud correct. Whoever saves one life saves the world entire. He saved 669 worlds, and in doing so he saved something else. Our faith that individual goodness matters, our belief that ordinary people possess extraordinary power, our conviction that one person, acting with courage and organization and persistence, can indeed change everything. This is the mathematics of one good man. This is what happens when someone cancels a skiing holiday and chooses instead to save the world one child at a time.